The infamous BMF title is on the line once again, and you could bet it's going to be a crazy clash. They chose the perfect fighters for this match in Justin Gaethje versus Max Holloway. Justin Gaethje is one of those rare, fearless fighters who isn't afraid to die in the cage. Meanwhile, you have Max Holloway, who's someone who just loves a good throwdown. Let's all agree that war runs through their veins. So the question here many are wondering is, who's gonna win and who has the edge? I studied both of these fighters for a very long time throughout my channel, detailing their signature tactics, their specific habits, and overall fighting style. My journey studying these fighters has been really fascinating, and I thought it's time to bring things all together to give you a much better idea of how they match up. This is going to be a fun breakdown, and it's going to be worth your time if you're looking to figure out who you think is going to win. You see, I discovered some really fascinating things that you're going to want to be aware of. And in the spirit of sports bets, this is going to be a useful resource for you. Even if you don't bet, there's a lot of interesting things to check out in what I discovered, so stick around in this video and you'll be really entertained by what I have to share. During my journey revisiting the studies on both these fighters, I couldn't help but notice such a drastic difference in the two fighters. I found a lot of consistency in Max's style and the tactics he's used across time. But when it came to Gaethje, it wasn't quite straightforward. Gaethje has been somewhat inconsistent in his style, but this isn't a bad thing, and I'll reveal why later on in this video. Max's style and his approach is normally consistent. You don't see too much of a stylistic shift. On occasions, you'll see him adapt and use other tools when it's necessary. For example, when he fought Yair Rodriguez, Max deployed the use of a lot of hopping kicks to jam Yair's leg. This worked effectively because it put Yair's kicking game at bay while allowing Max to build a lot of his offense. You see him use a lot of faking kicks to draw Yair's defenses up to introduce his boxing. This might actually be a very useful skill set to use against Gaethje, since he doesn't normally have a lot of aggressive striking responses or counter responses to taking those kicks. It's also a good way to introduce Max's punching into the mix, and this might actually be something really important to consider. You have to keep in mind that Gaethje has a tremendous amount of tools to shut down punches, and have to admit they're actually pretty vicious. If Max is looking to make the most of his jab entries, he could be looking at a variety of different counters coming his way. When it comes to dealing with the jab specifically, some of Gaethje's signature counters are the parry into the power shot. He'll often parry the jabbing arm, temporarily trapping them in range to fire that power shot. If Max isn't careful, he could get caught by that counter and the power shot like he has before. Now, keep in mind that this counter is something that Gaethje lands very consistently. It is really important to consider that Max's jab is typically more advanced than many of Gaethje's previous opponents. Max is just more cerebral at using it. He does have the tools to bait out those counters from opponents, and we saw this in display many times before when he would jab to bait out a reaction and then counter it. An equally important detail to keep in mind too is that Gaethje is not a stranger to facing good jabbers. Against Dustin Poirier, you can see glimpses of Dustin baiting to draw out the counter as well. See here where Poirier draws out the reaction with the jab, Gaethje bites, but the impressive part is that Gaethje remains defensively sound after the fact. So the question here is if Max can manage to capitalize on his baits in these scenarios. Max heavily relies on the jab to create his offensive entries, and one of his signature moves is using the double jab. Or you would see other jab uses like drawing the parry out with the jab and then hooking around the opening. So you get the idea. Most of his entries and his offensive approaches does rely a lot on using the jab. Either way, the heavy reliance on the jab will be very interesting as we see this fight play out. Will Max manage to execute his jab successfully, or will Gaethje be the one catching him with his counters? Another common counter Gaethje will use is actually timing a leg kick as they advance forward with the jab. Gaethje's timing with this counter is what makes this effective because opponents can't typically lift their leg up to block the kicks while they're trying to advance forward with the jab. Timing a kick is an easy way to disrupt the jab. But can Max counter these kicks though? From the habits I've observed, Max has really two options with dealing with kicks. He'll either evade them entirely, but the problem is that this actually takes him out of range, so he can't necessarily counter back as effectively. And the other option is to simply tank it and advance forward. From what we could see, typically if Gaethje kicks get evaded, it leaves a long window of time for opponents to capitalize, but it tends to be best suited if you just lift the leg to avoid the kick rather than to evade back. This lets you stay in range so that you could close the distance sooner. Similar to how Jose Aldo will just lift the leg up and keep himself inside the range to advance forward after they miss. Against Charles Oliveira, lifting the leg up helped to evade and let him stay in range so that he could still be in that range to attack Gaethje. Honestly, who really knows what Max is going to do? He might just actually just absorb the kick and advance forward like he's done before in the past. Body kicking could be a useful overall tool to build offensive openings for Max. Based on Gaethje's most recent fight, when Dustin would fire his kicks, Gaethje had this tendency to dip and lower his level. This seemed to be a consistent behavior that he would repeat after every kick that he received. From what I was able to notice, Max is the type of fighter who actually picks up on these habits quickly. When he sees a fighter react this way, he tends to quickly try capitalizing with knees. One thing you have to give Gaethje credit for is that he's very adaptable, even against Rafael Fiziev. When Fiziev noticed Gaethje's habit of dipping to lower that level, he tried to bait it out and land that knee too, but Gaethje read this quickly, and from what I was able to see, he didn't give those openings too much after those moments. So my question to you is this: do you think Max can capitalize on this habit, or will Gaethje manage to mitigate these risks? In my time studying Justin Gaethje's habits, one of the most astonishing observations I've made might have been the fact that he barely threw any jabs or even much at all. I actually don't recall even one jab thrown before he entered the UFC. Even after entering the UFC, there was still somewhat a limited usage of it. We really started to see it shine when he fought Rafael Fiziev. He specifically made use of the jab in the third round because he needed to keep himself at bay from the fast firefights that would break loose whenever he was in close range. I have covered that fight in a previous video, and you should go check that out if you want to see the specific tactics they use and how Gaethje landed the jab. But the overall idea that I want to point out here is that Justin does have access to the jab if he wants to use it against Max, but it may not be something he'll use much. What this could mean is that you might not see some of the various counter Max uses to counter the opponent's jab. One of his signature jab counters he uses is the rear parry into the jab follow-up. Now this is something that he lands very consistently, and he's very good at landing this. Max has fought some of the best jabbers in the division, and none could really actually escape the signature jab counter. It's likely that Gaethje could be on the receiving end of those counters too if he chooses to engage with the jab. Max is a smaller fighter, and it wouldn't be in his best interest to engage too close in the grappling range, especially with someone like Gaethje. He tends to be very good at making sure the opponents leave with punches if you engage with his grappling. One of his signature moves is catching the collar tie, stepping out with his lead foot, and then firing that hook on the exit. I covered this technique before, but in short, by stepping out laterally with that lead foot, Gaethje can open up a new defensive angle so that when he exits with his strikes away from the opponent usually has to turn towards him. Another one of his signatures is to slip with a jab and try to catch a collar tie, and then he fires his uppercut. Long ago, when I investigated Max's first fight with Volkanovski, I searched interviews to gain some insight on Volkanovski's game plan, and one critical thing I discovered was that Volk's team developed a plan around leg kicks. Long story short, the main reason why it was effective was that it took away Max's leaning stance that he uses to be offensive. This made it easier to put Max on the back foot in a stance where he wasn't as defensively sound. Overall, putting Max on the back foot often brings a lot of opportunity to find openings from what I was able to see. However, Max can still be dangerous if you attempt to advance without being defensively sound. For example, Korean Zombie would use a step over to advance forward on Max, but Max was able to catch him with a counter. Gaethje is also known to use a step over to advance as well, but he's far better at masking it with his rhythm and using dynamic head movement to stay defensively sound. Against Poirier, he was able to execute this consistently with minimal damage taken. Volk was able to find success putting Max on the back foot with the step over, so Justin might be able to do the same. This makes you wonder, can Gaethje use his step over to successfully land shots, putting Max on the back foot without getting countered? As far as I can see, Gaethje can use his tools advance forward to find his openings. One important thing to consider is that Gaethje is one of the hardest hitters in the lightweight division. If I recall, he hits the hardest in his weight class as they measured his power in the performance center, and even Khabib has commented on his power before as being one of the hardest hitters. This trait alone can make a big difference in the fight with Justin Gaethje and Max Holloway, and even if both fighters were close in skill, the one with more power is going to have the edge, and we kind of saw this play out a little bit with Poirier versus Max. There's a big difference in power, and it was just so significant. Max has focused on putting on more mass, but how much of a difference will it make in this fight? Now, it's certainly possible that Gaethje's power can shift the tide of what happens on a technical side. His counter punches are going to be more likely to put Max on the back foot, where he becomes more defensively vulnerable. His power is just something that has to be respected. Also keep in mind that Gaethje's kicks are going to carry a lot more weight, so who knows if Max will be able to tank them as well. If you're looking to place a bet on this fight, there's one really crucial aspect that you have to consider. But first, let me talk real quick about the team behind Pulse Predict. So there are a few of you in my audience who enjoy sports bets, and I realize some of you might use my work to help gain some perspective on bets. So this breakdown was centered on exploring how these fighters match up. I'm going to give my research to you, and you can make a better determination of who you favor to bet on. This is just a fun thing to do. Obviously, don't bet more than you can afford to lose, and if you do have problems, please seek help. I do play around to bet for funsies from time to time. I wanted to introduce this betting protocol called Pulse Predict, a sports betting service that happens on the blockchain. This isn't a paid promotion, but I am a big proponent of decentralization and using the blockchain for transparency and fairness. For sports betting, it removes third parties and shady practices, and the fees tend to be lower. Conventional bet services have fees like deposit, withdrawal, conversion fees. Betting on Pulse Predict, it removes many of these fees and leaves more of the profit in the user's hands. Payments are guaranteed, and they can't be held hostage by some kind of third party. Everything is fair and transparent like things should be, and you don't even have to give up personal information. It's anonymous and accessible globally. At the time of this video, for a limited time, anyone making sports bets on Pulse Predict will get an airdrop of this special Predict token for free. I don't own any of this yet, but you can be the first adopter of this innovation when it does unlock for users. Its use case hasn't been revealed yet, so you could sell it later on or you could keep it for its use case. It's really your choice. There are many reasons why betting here is better than using third parties where the house is involved. You do have options to bet various coins at the moment. Pulse Chain is where you can participate. There are a lot of variables that go into weighing someone's likelihood of winning a fight. One important aspect that you have to consider is a fighter's growth. This makes betting wildly difficult because we don't actually know what kind of adjustments or stylistic changes are made during their training camps. Going to a fight, this makes it wildly difficult to predict what likely technical things show up in a fight. Normally, you could predict a fighter is going to come in with relatively the same style and habits by looking at the history of their previous fights. You see that they repeat a lot of the same habits, and it's generally safer to make the prediction of how they might fight. With fighters like Justin Gaethje, he's a bit of a wild card. I spent a lot of time following and studying his style, and we detailed a lot of the changes he's made throughout his career. His ability to adapt and grow gives him a very good edge, but it can be hard to predict what he brings to the cage due to his ability to change and adapt. Just looking at his fight with Dustin Poirier in the rematch, many people wrote him off, but here on this channel we look carefully about the adjustments he's made. We talked about how the rematch could be very different just based on those changes. Gaethje used to be a fighter who used to be more stationary and just absorbed his shots in the guard. It lent itself well to getting comboed, and it's a perfect playground honestly for someone like Max Holloway, but he's no longer that fighter who's willing to take shots like he used to. And we see this very clearly in his fight against Dustin Poirier, at least in the rematch. He almost always chose to evade the damage now, making him much more effective defensively. It's a weird thing to watch because you see Gaethje do things like implementing a jab when he never really used it much before in his career, and then you start seeing him use things like a head kick more when he never really used it much before. His unpredictable nature and his use of different tools, his ability to grow is something that you have to keep in mind. Being unexpected can be a very dangerous thing, and let's take a look at an example when he fought Dustin Poirier in a rematch. Dustin would try to probe with his jab in order to bail out Gaethje's punching counters. What Poirier didn't expect though was a head kick. The thing is, Gaethje would normally respond to the opponent's punches using his own punching counters. Poirier got into the habit of feeling the rhythm of that range, and he got used to exchanging in the boxing range. So when Poirier came into bait, he retreated back, but only enough to avoid punches. He was still within the kicking range, and here Justin throws the rear hand out, prompting Poirier to try to parry it, but that kick comes in last moment where it couldn't be seen well. Poirier couldn't properly use both hands to defend the kick in time, nor was he even expecting the kick to be involved after getting used to Gaethje responding in the boxing range. This is a concept that you can use when you can recognize that someone is baiting your habit. They normally recognize your response to do something within a specific range, so a way to throw them off is by responding with a different range the way that Gaethje did here. Here's just another example where I'm getting baited with a lot of feints to engage, and the thing is that I can interrupt their sense of range because he's still outside of the boxing range but still within my kicking range, so instead of gauging with my punches, I just use the kicks. This is somewhat the wild card nature of Justin Gaethje. He throws wild card attacks that sometimes just throw off your rhythm, and in this case, he threw off Poirier's sense of range. There is an interesting conversation to be had here about betting on this fight, or who is favored to win. You have to take into account several different factors like their history of durability, their physical strength, their cardio, their susceptibility to injury, mental capacities, ability to grow, and things like their fighting style. I've given you some insight to get an idea of some of their stylistic aspects so that you can consider speculating on this fight. Tell me who you think is going to win this fight and why. Add some observations of what you think should also be considered in seeing who's most likely to win. I'd love to see them.